Now hear me out, you're sitting here, you're rolling around in your Jeep, trying not to clip your hand on the warped windshield. You're looking down at your speedometer that doesn't exist because it melted out. And you peer over the hood and there's a diesel engine just hating its way through the trails. That's what we're going for right here. It's going to be wicked. I'm actually filming part 2 of this video before the end of the first one because I have a friend coming over this weekend that is going to help me put in the almighty engine. Wait till you see what I've got planned. We have the factory Perkins diesel engine for a CJ5 and CJ6. These engines are rare as hen's teeth. To find a CJ5 or CJ6 with one of these installed for sale is about impossible, let alone finding one of these engines for sale that's not currently installed in the Jeep. I mean, this thing was probably a once-in-a-lifetime find the way that it sits right now. I'm no expert on diesels. This is the first diesel I've ever owned, ever worked on, so I'm really using the guidance of an owner of a diesel CJ6 and Sheffield Tractor's parts website for information on these diesels. What I've learned so far about this engine is that most were sold overseas, never came back to the United States, whereas ones in the United States, most of those Jeeps are sold to miners, went down in the mines, and most of the Jeeps just never made it back out. So what I've learned about these engines is that, yes, it is a Perkins 4-cylinder 192 cubic inch, and these also came in a Massey Ferguson 65 tractor. However, these only came in tractors that were built in the UK, and obviously not many of them came over to the United States. So if you tell someone you have a Perkins 4.192, that pretty much tells them that you have a Jeep engine. This is very similar to the Perkins 4.203 engine, just a little bit different borings from what I'm told. This engine is extremely rare in the Massey Ferguson tractor and extremely rare in the Jeep. And the fact that we have one sitting in front of us, not installed in anything, and we could do whatever we please, is absolutely amazing. Now, there are a lot of special Jeep parts involved with the 4.192, and the fact that we have those parts along with this engine is pretty crazy. The first thing is pretty obvious, is the bell housing to connect to the T90 transmission. On the left, we've got a factory CJ2A bell housing. On the right is the Perkins diesel bell housing. And the Perkins is a touch shorter. Now, what's crazy about these engines is that there are so very few produced for the Jeeps is that a lot of these parts are really homemade looking because there just was no need to mass produce them. Like the motor mount bracket, I seriously thought that this thing was homemade. I mean, the way it's cut out is really crude and not the prettiest, and I found out that that's actually a factory part. Same thing if you look at the motor mounts on this engine, the way that they're built, this all kind of looks hand cut out to me. The way that they've got the holes for the bolts and all that, I seriously thought that this was all homemade, but it is indeed original parts. And this is essentially a little reservoir that holds extra diesel fuel. So what this does is hooks up to the intake manifold. If I pop this off, you can see there's a little glow plug right here. There's only one on this engine. It's right on the intake. So it takes fuel from that reservoir and then it preheats up in the intake manifold. I've heard these don't work super well, but it's there for the thought anyways. Then obviously the air cleaner setup is special to a Jeep as well. These are parts that you really cannot find, and they don't really exist on the aftermarket world. Another part that's unique to the Jeep is this right here. This is special for use in the Jeep radiators, and you cannot find these on the tractor. So there's a lot of different little parts and pieces that can identify if it was an original Jeep engine, which we know that it was. And here is the serial number on the side of the block. We can zoom it in. It is 2506907. This fan is specific to a Jeep as well as the radiator. But I am told that the radiator for a V6 Jeep should work about the same for this engine. That's simply because the way that the hoses are routed on the engine. It's kind of opposite on the F head where the radiator outlets come out, so we'll see what we can make work. I've already done some measuring of this engine. I know it's about 3.5 inches longer than an F head or an L head engine, and my concern is that this front end's can be really close to the front axle of the Jeep, especially under flexing situations. So I'm going to have to watch out for that. And then I do know for a fact that this is as tall as an F head, I believe, in the sense that what sticks up, if you measure from the middle of the crankshaft to the top of the engine, it's about the same height as an F head, which means this thing's going to stick all the way out of the hood of the Jeep, so we're not going to be running a hood at all. With the engine, I also received 2 parts books. These are all original paperwork. This first one here is the nicest shape of the both, and it says parts peculiar to Perkins diesel Jeep models CJ5 and CJ6, and it's got, I'm assuming, a previous owner's names wrote on it, and they've got the VIN number to the engine right here, but this VIN number of a Jeep is incorrect for a diesel CJ5. That's just a standard open body CJ5 VIN number. So I'm not quite sure what went on. Very possible that this Jeep is one that my engine was swapped into and then was pulled back out of that Jeep, because I heard that the previous owner went with a small block Chevy. You know, go figure. And then the other book that I've got is one called Perkins Diesel Engines Parts Book, applicable to 4.192 vehicle diesel engine for Kaiser Jeep Corporation. And these just have all sorts of just little parts and diagrams and numbers and, you know, just priceless information. Alrighty, enough talk. We're going to get this thing ready to rock. I'm going to cut the old motor mounts out of the Jeep frame, bolt on the belt housing, and it should be about ready to drop in. Well, I do say the old Perkins diesel fit in the CJ2A pretty well. It was a bear getting this thing in, and we just did not have time to film installing the engine and getting it hooked up. But basically what we did was very carefully let it down inside the chassis. That is because we had a really tight clearance on the steering system. You can see it's maybe a 1/4 inch away from the side of the engine block right there. And we did have to notch the firewall a little bit, which kind of sucks. But same thing with an F-head engine. It was hitting the injector right here, injector number 4. And I didn't want the engine rattling and hitting against the body right here. And then also there's a stud for the valve cover that's sitting right underneath the cowl here. So you can never remove the valve cover while the engine is in the Jeep. You'd have to lift up the whole tub. So we had to do that. And then as for the motor mounts, really this one, I just took some pieces of rubber and straight bolted the engine to the original plates. Everything lined up perfectly. And then on this side, I actually did use an original motor mount. There is a plate that actually extends the motor mount holes down. They're about 1.5 inches off the original mount. We could not physically slide the engine more to the passenger side. So what we did is just made the bracket to slide it down a little bit. And the problem we had is that we did drill some new bolt holes to bolt the motor mount to that bracket. But the problem was that we did not have enough room between the Jeep frame and the bolt to actually get a nut on. The clearance is so tight, so we just welded it together. The name of the game on this engine install was get it in as fast as possible. Who cares what it looks like, because look what we're working with. And then as for that, pretty much everything else is self-explanatory. We put on the new fuel pump, and then we used an original Jeep PCV valve hardline to connect to the fuel tank here. And then as for the key switch, all we really do is power to the key switch and then a starter button, and that's all you have on the key switch is just 2 wires of the diesel, which is pretty sweet. So once the fuel comes into this right here, the lift pump, it goes into a fuel filter, then from the fuel filter into the high pressure fuel pump, and from here it goes into all the injectors. Now to shut the Jeep off, there you should have a cable hooked up to this right here. You pull this back and that shuts off the fuel. There's no other way to kill a diesel unless you're able to block off the air cleaner. One issue we did have with installing the diesel is I had to bend the original mud tray up right here, and then when installing the engine we had extremely tight clearance between the oil filter and the original motor mount bracket. I mean, we were barely 1/8 inch off that plate as we were going down into the bell housing. Now as we go inside the Jeep, you could see I actually had to cut the floor out for the diesel bell housing because it's just so big. We really didn't have any other choice, which kind of sucks, but at the same time doesn't, because this floor had no structural integrity, and I actually bent the gas pedal in half while wobbling the floor around. But yeah, the diesel bell housing, if you want to do a really good install in a Jeep, you'd probably want to cut this whole floor out and make a really nice removable floor cover for that section. Now, as you may know, on a CJ5, the front axle is 3/4 of an inch further forward. Now, why does that matter on a flat fender? Well, check out the crankshaft on this bad boy. As of right now, the crank is maybe a tick behind the front axle. I think when I let this thing down on the suspension and then you flex it, I could easily see the crankshaft pulley hitting the axle. So moving the axle forward 3/4 of an inch would probably fix that problem, just like it did in the CJ5. And obviously you cannot run a hood with this thing at all. If you wanted to run a hood, you'd have to, at the minimal, cut out this section of the hood, and then you'd have to run maybe an elbow to an air cleaner and put that over here on the side. And speaking of air cleaner, I also had to remove the original air cleaner bracket on the Jeep, which would sit right about back here. My last piece of advice here is the radiator setup. Now, we've got the F134 radiator on this thing, and man, I don't know if it would work at all, honestly. The radiator hose is right in front of the fan. You can see we've got this thing butted right up against the grill, and to clear the fan, you'd have to slide the whole radiator off to the side. But the problem, if you slide that one off to the side, the one down here is already right next to the crankshaft. So if you slide it over, you're at some extremely tight tolerances. It'd have to be a really sharp 90-degree elbow in there. Injector number 4, we have 2 fuel fittings. One fitting returns straight to the fuel filter, and the other fitting goes straight to the return on the fuel tank. I only did this setup because I was not able to hook up that little diesel reservoir that goes to the glow plug on the intake here, because that reservoir actually had stripped out threads inside of it, so it's not usable at all. But overall, I'm extremely happy how well this thing fit. Open or closed?
It's closed.
Okay, it's all closed.
I think it's ready to start.
Get the clipboard. You're in charge of the clipboard, and if it starts to run away, we can just block it.
Yeah.
So we want to probably move this over here.
Yeah, move that over on that side.
Okay, and then we'll get the chooching over here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, before we do it, let's crank it one time just to make sure it doesn't spray diesel everywhere. True. Yeah. We're good.
I'll ether bomb it. Just. Alright. Alright, get ready for a runaway.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. She must have
ripped. You want to get Ear Pro?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Holy. There is some slight blow-by involved with this thing. Holy.
Understatement.
My eyes are burning. Is it leaking so bad we're not getting fuel to the injector? Yep.
Yep.
Yepers. It starts. All this rust just rattled off the Jeep when we were running the engine. The more this thing runs, the more it falls apart, which is hilarious. So when I started the engine up for the first time, we saw a lot of smoke coming out of the thermostat housing. And my fear is that we have a cracked head, a block, or a bad head gasket. So what we're doing is filling up the engine with water. Then we'll look down the thermostat housing to see if it starts to boil. We've got a little bit of leakage right here because I don't have a bolt for this. But I figure I can put water in faster than it's leaking out. I know, just as fast as we put this engine in the Jeep, I had to take it right back out. She had 5 full minutes of freedom of driving around the front yard out there. And it took us 2 full days to put this thing in the Jeep last weekend. It took me less than 1 hour to remove the whole thing out of the Jeep. Granted, there wasn't a lot to take off. Most of our time last weekend was spent messing with all these little hard lines and making gaskets for the filters, installing the fuel pump, etc. And we just had some problems with the engine, and I'm no diesel mechanic, but I know for a fact that we should not have coolant leaking out of injector number 2. That means that we've got some sort of head gasket leak. Coolant is obviously getting into the combustion chamber, so that's not good. And another thing you may notice in the video of it running and driving is that we were getting exhaust smoke, it looked like, exhaust smoke to me, out of the thermostat housing. And when I put coolant inside the engine, it was bubbling in here, which means that it's getting some sort of combustion out into the coolant as well. So there's something mixing around in there. But what's weird is that I checked the oil right before I drained out of the Jeep. There was no milk shaking. I didn't see any moisture in there. So who knows what's really going on. If this was any other engine, I would just send it in the Jeep, take it off-road, and do whatever I want with it. But this thing is just so rare. If I put a window on the side of the block, it would just destroy me. Taking one of these out of circulation. I'm not quite sure I'm going to upload these videos yet because it's so confusing on how I built the Jeep. I might do it really simple where I build the Jeep just with the flathead engine in it, show it off-roading, and then show the diesel swap. But in reality, the process was build half the Jeep AK. We only have half the brakes done. I have no brake lines on it. I installed the engine, the diesel, showed it didn't work, so I'm pulling it back out, putting the brakes on the Jeep, then the flathead. So swapping back and forth between engines might be a little confusing. Curiosity's got the best of me, and I'm like, you know what, we got to take the head off this engine and just see exactly what went wrong. Is it just a head gasket? Is it cracked head, cracked block, etc.? What I noticed when I pulled the injectors is that injector number 2, which is the one that was leaking water, is absolutely soaked on the inside while the other 3 are dry. Alright, we're looking real time here on the top of the engine block. I'm going to pull the head gasket off and see just exactly what we might find.